This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I am here today with Nicola Buskirk, who is with Elessar Books, and Elessar Books also has a Substack, and I'll put the links there for you guys, and we're going to be talking about books, Tolkien, and other assorted things today. Nicola, so, I've known you for a little while, just like I've known a lot of people, by the way, who I do podcasts with. I think some of you know that, so not a big surprise. And I know that you have a fascination or a love of Tolkien. And so, Elessar, tell the less nerdy listeners out there who Elessar is.
Okay, I mean, I can start. Do you want me to start by telling you what the company does, my company does, or what the
if you want to start that way, you can start that way. We're gonna get to that. We're gonna get to that. Yeah.
There's a connection there, like why the company is called Elessar. So what the company does is it is like a book publisher that the goal is basically putting out of print books and works like back into print that have been forgotten. Like it's kind of what inspired it was I just went down enough internet rabbit holes where I would run into books, documents, what have you, that were impossible to get my hands on. There's like one $200 copy on Amazon or a bad PDF or whatever. And I figured I wanted the books for myself. So I started just reformatting them and now turned it into a company and to republish out of print books. And it took me a little bit to pick a name, and I landed on Elessar because of the Lord of the Rings character and object. Two things related. Elessar in Lord of the Rings is Aragorn's royal name, and that comes from this like elf stone that he wears, and that's given to him by Galadriel. And it's the name he takes when he becomes king of Gondor and Arnor and fulfills his destiny. And the whole kind of theme behind the name Elessar, the actual like the power of the object it's the idea of like old made new, healing, renewal, and that's also kind of the theme that you're left with when Aragorn comes into his birthright and becomes king, and after defeating Sauron, there's like a whole idea of like renewal and like healing Middle Earth. And so I thought it was pretty on point if you're trying to get like long lost books back into print and kind of making what's old new again in a very beautiful way too.
Yeah, so one of the things I will say, so most of the listeners and also the viewers on YouTube know of the Lord of the Rings movies from 20 years ago by Peter Jackson. Obviously, the series, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, I think they were published in the 50s, and then were put in paperback in the 60s and got like super popular that way. So there's a big gap there. But most people know Aragorn, Elessar. I don't know if he called Elessar in the film.
I know the Elessar stone that he wears in the book is changed. It's like not. It's called like the Even Star or something. It's something that Arwen gives him as like a gift. Mm-hmm. But that's okay. It's a different thing. They kind of got rid of the actual stone. I don't remember if at the end of the movies they call him Elessar.
Well, because at the end of the movies, there's also some Elvish, and we're not really following.
Yeah,
exactly. Like he could have, it could have been. He could have been called Elessar in the Elvish, and we're not like following the language. So I want to ask you really quickly. I want to talk a little bit about Tolkien. Can you talk a little bit about your perception of like how the movie character, which is, Viggo Mortensen's character is Aragorn to most Americans versus what you see in the books.
Yeah. I will admit, I saw the movies way before I read the books. So for a while, like that was the Aragorn I knew. And that's, I have to blame my parents for that, though I can't be too mad about it. They literally showed me, I think it started when my brother and I were like maybe like 3 or 4 years old, and asked what a knight was. And then my mom was like, well, I'll just show you. And so she puts on a battle scene in maybe, it might have been Return of the King or Two Towers. And it was like from that moment on, and then it starts getting like very bloody. My mom turns it off because we're 4 years old. And then we immediately start yelling at her to put it back on. And from then on, it was like the movies were what I knew and just watched those on repeat growing up. And so I only read the books when I was kind of more like late teen years, I think. The Hobbit when I was younger, but like the books in late teen years. And the Aragorn, I think Peter Jackson is like actually stayed pretty true to the books, which was pretty impressive. But Aragorn in the books is much less reluctant to take his birthright. He's like he from the get-go, he is like knows who he is. He knows what he's meant to do, and he is like this. He's a very confident leader that like fully accepts his destiny. He's going to become king of Gondor. He's going to reunite Arnor, and like that is his mission. There's not really any doubt or anything like that from him, which is very different from the Aragorn you get from the Peter Jackson movies, where I think the purpose why they changed him was to add more of like a character arc to the story, like give him maybe a little bit more relatability or something. But he seems more of like a loner, unassuming figure when we meet him. There's more self-doubt about his like destiny and his role. He like there's a moment when he's talking to Galadriel about Arwen, and he says something about how he would like rather see her go west with the rest of her people, and it's kind of this moment of where he's expressing doubt about his ability to fulfill his quest in defeating Sauron because he wants to like get her safe. And you don't really see that kind of doubt that happening in the books. Where obviously there's a lot of struggles and like ups and downs in the journey, but there's like a lot of moments also in the movie where he is kind of reluctant to take his place as the heir of Isildur because it kind of expresses this I guess like he basically says that he doesn't want to make the same mistakes as his ancestors, where like some of the backstory here is just that his distant ancestors were Elendil and then his son Isildur, which also I might be pronouncing completely wrong, but feel free to correct me there.
That's what they say in the Rings of the Power. So
okay. Well, we know that's completely accurate.
We're gonna get into that.
Oh gosh. Okay. And Elendil and his son Isildur fight Sauron like many generations ago. Elendil gets killed by Sauron. Sauron breaks his sword. This sword later becomes Anduril, which is Aragorn's sword. But before that, Isildur takes up that sword, that broken sword, cuts off Sauron's finger, then cuts the ring off then also takes the ring from Sauron, thus like defeating him in that age. But when it actually comes down to it, Isildur is not able to cast the ring into the fire and destroy it, and then he becomes corrupted by the ring. And so you see like that whole past haunting Aragorn more in the movies that doesn't really come up in the books. Like Aragorn knows who he is in the books, which I think also is. But I also want to hear like some of your takes on this. But I thought like the whole.
Okay. Yeah, and I broadly I agree. So it became a big thing. Actually, I was in 6th grade, and a bunch of the guys started reading these books that were. I'm not a big fiction guy. Most of the listeners and viewers will know that I really didn't start reading fiction until I was a teenager. But I made a few exceptions. Yeah, I'm just a nonfiction person. I'm weird. Okay, I mean, I think people out there know that. I don't think it's like a big
no judgment.
A big revelation. Kind of dead inside, but no, I did read the books. And when the movies came out, I also thought, but it was a big gap for me, and I was at, I was like 10 or whatever, or 11. And so it was I was psychologically in a different state. But I will say, I do think, to me, from what I remember, a lot of the character depth and psychological complexity that there was in the books is around the hobbits in general. Whereas everybody else, it's not like they weren't psychologically complex, but they played their roles. And I guess, if in hindsight, I didn't think about it this way at the time, they were more like stock characters. They were more fulfilling their destiny, like Elessar, like Aragorn. Gandalf Gandalf is kind of a real person, but Gandalf also, he can't die. Gandalf is he's a Maya. He's an expression of a force of nature almost. Sauron is, he's the ultimate evil now that Melkor is gone, all of these things. So the hobbits in the books are the bourgeois, are the English gentry, which everyone knows. Tolkien kind of based them on the English gentry. So they're the relatable people, which they're not totally relatable, because the relationship between Frodo and Samwise has a class valence, I feel, that did not speak to late 20th century Americans, which is what I was. And I think what you're alluding to about Aragorn in the film, Elessar in the film, and why he is a more complex, ambivalent character is Peter Jackson he's a new guy from New Zealand. He is writing and directing writing the script, or not. He's not writing the script. I don't think he wrote the script, but he was heavily involved, and he directed, and it's geared towards an American audience. I think an American audience, we are not naturally monarchists. It's something that's a little bit ingrained in us. So if there's going to be a king, it better be a reluctant king. So I think that's my take on what's going on there. That's the way that you make him sympathetic, because he didn't want to be king. It was thrust upon him, and he had to take the responsibility eventually. And that is the arc that we can relate to when it comes to a monarch. Whereas, in other cultures, or in the past especially, it's not, the monarch is not reluctant. The monarch is just a part of life. It's a part of the world. J.R.R. Tolkien grew up in South Africa, but he lived most of his life in England. Obviously, the British people have monarchs. It's just part of their existence as a nation. And you don't have to go through this, I really don't want the power. Like, there's power, you have the power, that's your role in society. So that would be my take on that. Excuse me. I think I want to say, in terms of like the book publishing and these old ideas and stuff like that, in a way, it makes a little bit more sense of what Aragorn is in the books and what he represents, because he represents a revival of something great that has fallen and a coming back to what it was. So I don't, and this is like a minor thing, but I feel that the critics who say filming in New Zealand actually gave people the wrong view, in a way, of Middle Earth, because it seems very vivid, alive, vibrant. Whereas actually the Third Age at that period, basically civilizations retreated mostly to Gondor, really. There's a few of these, Lothlorien, there's a few of these places that the elves are living, but really the world is pretty decayed and collapsed. Like, Numenor is gone, the Kingdom of Arnor is gone, and so it doesn't communicate that aspect. So I think in terms of old books and reviving what was and making it what can be, I think it connects more to the books. And so that's why I wanted to ask you about Elessar, because I think in a way, Elessar, the differences are important when we're trying to understand tradition, learning, scholarship, and all these things, because in the movies, he is a bit of an American trope of, kind
very
of like
much so.
reluctant king and all that stuff. And, there's stuff that's like cut out. He's actually, so Americans love everyman. He's obviously not an everyman, but the movie de-emphasizes how much he is not an everyman. Most people don't know the lore, and there's a scene in the movie where he talks about how old he is, and that was deleted. So I think he's like over 100 years old in the movie because
it's something like that, or like 80 or 90 or something like that.
Yeah, he's a Dunedain. And so that Dunedain are descendants of the Númenóreans, and they were given long life by the Valar and Ilúvatar. I think it's actually the Valar to reward them in the first age, and so they're like almost a separate species. They're almost like demigods, and I think Americans would be really uncomfortable with that. And there's things in Tolkien that Americans in the modern age just they don't like make any sense to us because we're not early 20th century people. Tolkien's an early 20th century person, and that's his moralistic sense. And so I think it's a little difficult for us to understand. And we'll get to that with the Rings of Power later because I think that explains some of the problems. But I want to like ask you, like, you're very young. We don't need to get into the exact age. Like this isn't the whatever podcast. Yeah, this isn't the whatever podcast. I don't need to like ask, all the details about your personal life. But so how would you say, because you are a Zoomer, I'll say that. How is Tolkien relevant to you guys? Because you live in this TikTok world, and I mean, like, these are books. These are very old books by a very old guy that I think he was born in the late 19th century. But
he
it's
fought
still
in World War One, not even World War Two.
Yeah, World War One. So he's these are ancient works from the pre-internet days, pre-television days, even. And I'm kind of wondering how it's relevant to you. So I just like by way of like kind of like setting the stage, in the 60s, even though Tolkien himself was not a hippie, it was taken up by the hippies, The Hobbit, and Fellowship of the Ring, and all these books because like The Shire and this kind of like pastoral setting, which was perceived to be anti-industrial, which I think he was actually. So
I think he was too.
But yeah, he was. I mean, he clearly was. So
I don't think in a hippie way though.
Yeah, and I think like when I was a kid, I'll just like say, when I was a kid in the late 20th century, nuclear war was a thing that we always thought about. So when you're thinking about Sauron and the Dark Evil, you kind of thinking about the Soviet Union, but also you're thinking about like the spectrum of the mushroom cloud and just basically like the end of everything. And so when you're reading stuff like that, or you're watching films before about 1991, especially if you're young, really not everyone, pretty much everyone, I think that was something that was there. And I think it's not quite there anymore. So your generation obviously grew up in the wake of 9/11 and all that. I'm just wondering how you guys view this story and why it speaks to you. You encountered in your late teens. Like, what was it that really hooked you?
Okay, I'll start with the good interpretations of like how it's been like taken up, I think, by my generation, or I think where it has appeal. I mean, for me, I was really young when I first encountered it, so I think I'll start with my reaction just revisiting it just in the last week or so for this podcast. It was just like this really, really refreshingly hopeful story that you like quite honestly like never see in like modern media. Like everything feels very, very bleak in a lot of like basically anything that gets put out in the recent years. Or at least like cynical, like I think cynical and bleak at worst. At best, it's a little like wayward. Nothing like there's not a strong foundation for the story or for the characters. There's no like higher ideal to be reached for. And I think like Lord of the Rings is just the opposite of that, where there's this really clear divide between how you should act, how you shouldn't, like moral, like what is moral, what is not, what is like good and true and beautiful, and like what is evil. And you have all these characters who are kind of struggling with that in different ways and like trying to be good, but like not, sometimes failing, sometimes not. You have like Frodo's whole arc is basically about this whole like struggle against the temptation of the ring. and like knowing what he has, like a goal. He has a very clear goal, and like he knows what he should do, and that is like throw the ring to the fire. But there's just like increasingly overwhelming burden and temptation on him towards evil because of the ring, and that seems like very reflective of human nature to like varying degrees. And or like you see like with Boromir too, where he's a good character who has good intentions. Like he wants to use the ring to like defeat Sauron and save his people and everything, but he kind of fails in not realizing that he's using an evil instrument trying to do good, but just using that evil instrument is like in itself doing evil. It's like in how Tolkien's writing it, and trying to take it from Frodo at the end of the Fellowship is like a betrayal of him. But you see him like kind of realize that this recognize this betrayal and kind of seek repentance. And so all this to say is that like all these kind of good characters trying to strive for like a higher ideal, strive for good, like in various ways, is very refreshing for someone who's like, you know, grown up just in the 21st century. And it feels like the world is very devoid of anything concretely good to strive for, which sounds kind of abstract, but this is like, I think there's like a kind of sense of like listlessness, like people feel lost, like in my generation, which is like why you see like mental illness, anxiety, depression, is because there's like so much navel gazing going on, because you don't have like any clear like outside force or standard or anything to strive for, or models to look up to like try and model your own life after. And I think Tolkien like provides that extremely well. And I think also which I think this is something that most people reading it would maybe not, or like my age would maybe not like immediately hit on. But I think Tolkien's whole idea of like the eucatastrophe, which is kind of this, just to define it, it's like this massive like turn in fortune when there's like no hope at all for victory, but victory still happens. But it's like brought about by kind of the grace of a higher power, or like just a very unexpected turn of events, rather than purely human heroic effort. And that's kind of how Lord of the Rings ends, with like Frodo and Gollum's fight at Mount Doom, where Frodo ultimately fails and does not cast the ring to the fire because he's just like overwhelmed by the temptation of it. And then he and Gollum struggle for it, and it's like this whole it's like scenario that makes sense, but like completely unforeseen moment where both of them
divine providence.
Divine providence, where like both of them have kind of given into the evil and want it, and then Gollum bites Frodo's finger off, takes the ring, and then dances himself into the fire and destroys the ring. And I think it's like that whole idea of divine providence also is like fair. I think it's even if that's not what people would maybe touch on, is like very appealing. And when rather than having the kind of stress and anxiety of like feeling like absolutely every choice you make is going to decide your fate and the fate of the world, and like everything you do like matters like really deeply, which it matters deeply, and Tolkien thinks that, but on a moral level, not on like a you're deciding the fate of the world level.
Yeah, well, you know, some of the listeners and viewers, I mean, I'm sure they're thinking back. There's a scene where Frodo, I think it's Frodo, is in the films. I don't remember, frankly, like the exact details in the books, but Frodo is wondering, why don't they just kill Gollum? And Gandalf says, you don't know his purpose. And so that's actually kind of, you know, it's basically like, now you know the purpose at the end, right? That's the payoff. Okay. Yeah. Why is Gollum still around? Like, what's the point of this kind of wretched being, former hobbit? And well, it turns out that, you know, even Frodo at the end of the day was weak, and he could not resist temptation. And ultimately Gollum's wretched like venality is in a way what ends up saving the world, because, you know, as you say, he takes the ring, dies, and the ring disappears, and you have salvation, right? So I think that that's a very interesting, I think people sometimes they view Tolkien as, oh, it's like this simple good and evil narrative, but if
it's
you
so
look
wrong.
closely, okay, so I mean, elaborate that, because I think if you look, it's actually pretty complicated.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you just keep going back to like that last moment where the ring gets destroyed, it's like if it was a simple good and evil story, Frodo would just through his like sheer willpower have like overcome evil, like good overcomes evil. He throws the ring into the fire, happy day. And that's not at all what happens, because like the natures of good and evil are like more complicated than that. And even though like Frodo, I would still like call Frodo like the hero of the story, the ending is like not good defeats evil. It's kind of like evil defeating itself through, like, that's like the great irony that like kind of ties the whole story together, is that the mechanism that the ring uses to keep itself in existence, there's like people's desire for it, is ultimately like what destroys it. And I think that's like but it also could not have gotten that to that point. It could have not have been in the right position for it to be destroyed if not for Frodo carrying the burden throughout the whole trilogy and bringing it to that point. So it's like this kind of very like complicated interweaving of like the good people, like the heroes, Frodo doing this heroic effort and resisting the ring, and like Sam's loyalty to Frodo too. It's like is getting him there. Frodo's mercy towards Gollum and not killing him is like what brings all three of them to that point where, even though ultimately like the temptation of the ring overcomes Frodo, it still gets destroyed. Like the evil still destroys itself.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. Contrast this with A Song of Ice and Fire, which obviously is from George R. R. Martin like thought it up in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And I actually like both series. I encountered Song of Ice and Fire considerably later, which was good.
Yeah.
just putting that out there. I'm just realizing, like, what would 10-year-old Razib have thought about this? So I was in my early 20s, and that was okay.
That's good.
But, yeah, I had never thought about that. I was like, yeah, like it's really good. The timing was really good.
Yeah.
But so Martin explicitly, and he's not religious. Tolkien is religious. They have like different worldviews. And Martin, he wanted to create a world where there was more shades of gray. And there's a good and a bad, and I'm not going to talk about the TV series too much, because like I don't, and he's probably not going to finish it,
Yeah,
but probably not. I mean, just being honest here. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but we all know. Okay.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And
well, I mean, what were you in elementary school during the? No? I mean, maybe not.
Yes,
but...
actually, I think maybe middle school.
Okay,
maybe
so
like high school or something. Yeah.
You know what? I'm gonna do a quick sidebar, and I'll get back to like because we have an outline of stuff we want to talk about. So in 2005, in early 2005, a friend of mine was saying, who I'd introduced the series to, because I introduced the first 3 books to him, and he was like, "Oh, this is great! I heard rumors on the internet the next book is about to come out." And it'd been 5 years, and I was like, "Bro, whatever. Like, just keep on waiting. Like, you'll have kids by the time the next book." But it turned out the next book came out, Feast for Crows, and then was it Dancing with Dragons in 2011. So then you have to wait 6 years, and but he was just like, "Whoa, like 6 years," because he was messaging me. He's like, "I remember," and then I got it. And now 6 years not looking so bad.
I mean, sure, what is it, like 10, 12, I think they're going on now?
Yeah, 2000, it was like spring of 2011.
Oh,
I think
really?
Yes, it was spring.
I didn't realize it was that long ago.
Yeah, it's 12 years. It's 12 years. It's going to be like 13 years soon. And then he has another book supposedly after that. But okay, there's I'm
Yeah.
not going to post a link to it on the show notes because it's not appropriate. But there's like some funny comedy sketches of what he's really doing instead of writing the book. Like he's jumping on a trampoline. You know, he's doing like fantasy football. I mean, it's at this point it's kind of entertaining. How long some people are still waiting, because I kind of gave up.
Yeah.
I mean,
if I was him, you have like now
not
it's
that
like
many years.
2 successful shows. I was gonna say you have other things that are like more top of the list, like 2 successful shows.
He has a lot of things. He has a lot of things. Yeah.
And who knows what else? But yeah, I mean, you don't even need to at this rate.
I think it's a little bit like declaring Gmail bankruptcy or something.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you just have to do it and be like, so it's like you have too many emails.
Oh, okay.
As your career gets more advanced, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. But I'm just gonna be honest, that's gonna happen. So you have too many emails, and you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna respond," and then eventually Gmail starts reminding you have like all these things you haven't responded to, and people are just like, "Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna like mark them all as read or delete them all, and I just like email me again. I'm just declaring bankruptcy." Okay. So Martin should just be like, "Look, I'm declaring A Song of Ice and Fire bankruptcy. I'm not going to finish it, okay? I got other stuff going on. I'm going to be around for another 10, 20 years, and I want to enjoy my life. I'm super rich. Like, I have, like, a wolf, like, you know, refuge and all that stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on, so I don't, like, I'm not hating. Yeah, it's interesting, though. When I was in my 20s, I'll say, Nicola, when I was in my 20s, you know, I'd read some fantasy in my teens. You know, obviously Tolkien was a little earlier, but I really did enjoy A Song of Ice and Fire because it was like, ooh, it's like dark and you know, there's like evil stuff happening, and like, I mean, have you read those books?
I can't say I remember them that well, but I watched the whole series. I watched House of the Dragon. I have read the first 2.5 books, but it was a while ago.
Yeah, so I mean, the books are nastier than the TV series.
Yeah, I remember that much. Yeah,
I'm like, bro, like this is like shit's dark, you know. So you know, now I have to say I'm like over it. I think you just go through phases in your life, and you know, like maybe like I was a cynical 20-something, and now I'm just like, you know what? There's enough like negativity and cynicism and shades of gray in the world. I don't think I want to read that sort of stuff too much anymore. If Martin publishes a book, I will probably read it. I'm not like honestly 100% sure, but I probably will. But I'm just pointing out here, like in terms of Tolkien versus grimdark and some of these new genres of new genres, and there's swings that go back and forth. And it's a little bit like you know, Superman versus Batman. I'm not a comic books person, but you know, Superman is, you know, kind of like apparently Superman is popular during times of crime and chaos because you want this like omnipotent person, whereas Batman is, you know, it's kind of almost a luxury belief, as Rob Henderson would say, because Gotham is like, you know, dark, and we want this like complicated character who's actually not a superhero but just a regular person who runs around in a bat suit. And the thing is, like, the whole thing is like a little ridiculous, right? So they have different like different flavors that I think are appropriate at different times. So I wanna move on. Like, ask kind of like, you know, some people will think this is like a little bit of a weird question, but I want to just throw this out there. So Tolkien said, so most of the people out there know that Tolkien was a very devout Roman Catholic. He was very disappointed that C.S. Lewis didn't become a Catholic. Actually, he was excited that C.S. Lewis became a Christian, but he was very disappointed that C.S. Lewis did not become a Catholic. Roman Catholic, and he said that you know, his work is fundamentally religious and Catholic, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. I was just interested in this because, like, you know, neither of us are Catholics. You are Christian, but you're not a Catholic. I wonder what you think of it, because I think a lot of people have opinions about these sorts of things, and I'm just curious, like, how much it matters what the author thinks and what the, you know, and this is like a question for literary analysis and postmodernism, but have you thought about it? Like, you're not Catholic, but you love the books. Like, I mean, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I think, at least like how I read them, and I think, I think the Catholic themes in them are more Christian than Catholic. They're more like across the board. Because it's all, I mean, like, there's like the quote from Tolkien that I like about this is, I'll just read. It says, "In The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It is about God and his sole right to divine honor. Sauron desired to be a god king and was held to be this by his servants. If he had been victorious, he would have demanded divine honor from all rational creatures and absolute temporal power over the whole world." Which, like, that summary, that could have been written by a Protestant, a Catholic, any Christian. And I think that theme carries throughout the whole, like, which I also want to talk about, like, the whole, I'm curious what you think, but the overall message for me in these books is choosing hope over despair, no matter the situation. And that's also very Christian over Catholic. Or it's both. It's not like specifically Catholic.
You're saying it's a superset. In terms of it's a very, very broad, it's a broader message. I just wanted to know what you think, because I know you're a serious Christian.
Yeah.
So I'm presumably you're giving a little thought to this.
Yeah, definitely. I think the strength also in the work is that it's not overtly religious. It's like it's clearly written by Tolkien, who's a Catholic, and is imbuing it with these like very religious Christian Catholic themes. But these are all themes that are like very universal. And I think it's like the strength that he brings to the work because of his religiosity is like I think it's this whole like concrete moral foundation that is absent, like I said earlier, like from a lot of other works that are written now, where he has there are clear ideals that should be aspired to, and things that people should not do, and ways people should not act. And having that template, I think, is very it just speaks to people regardless of religion. And it's also the story is not an allegory at all. I think he was very clear about that. He does not like allegories. Like the characters are not religious themselves. They're not like praying or worshiping, anything like that. And that means that like basically anybody who's religious or not can pick up the book and like have these like the characters and the story and the themes like really speak to them without feeling there's some valence or like veil between them, because they're not religious. And I think like part of I think one of the biggest part of it is like the always choosing hope rather than giving into despair, which like I think one of my favorite like two story arcs in the series is Theoden's and Eowyn's two story arcs, which to me like are very, it's all kind of all about them starting at like a point of despair about like the world and Rohan and everything, and ending in a place of like hope and renewal. And I can go on this tangent for as long as you want, but I also want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I pretty much agree with you. So I'm not, as you probably know, I'm not religious at all, but I do think I don't see the thing that's specifically Catholic about it. I mean, in fact, I didn't like drop the word, but it was almost like what happened between Frodo and Gollum at the end was almost predestined. So that's obviously not Catholic. So I'm just like
the part that was like felt like less Catholic to me, where it felt like things were more there was more a predestination point to the story.
Yeah, which like and just for the listeners, like obviously I don't want to like we're not going to get into a theological discussion here, but there is a strain of Catholicism starting with St. Augustine that is kind of predestination oriented, but in general in modern Western Christianity that has been the forte of Calvinism, and which is obviously not Catholic. And so to me, I do think that Tolkien is an Englishman of the last name, like paternal lineage is actually I think from Hanover. I think it was during the Hanover phase in the 18th century. There were Germans that came over. He has a generic Protestant background, even though he converted to Catholicism, or his mother converted to Catholicism and then raised him as a Catholic, right? So I think that's just an interesting thing to point out. I think this is true in the United States. A lot of Catholics, even serious Catholics, still have Protestant presuppositions I'm dropping the word presupposition in there for some of you who know what I'm talking about there. But, so I think this is important to understand the cultural background of someone. In terms of universal themes, I do think that's a real thing. There is, I don't know if it's postmodern, but there is a tendency to engage in subversion and inversion in some contemporary narratives. And, some stories just end with the bad guy winning, or they're super bittersweet. And, it kind of leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. And sometimes it's okay, because it's like, oh, okay, that's a thing. But sometimes, you want a good meal, that's well balanced, well composed, and looks nice. And I think Tolkien's storytelling is part of that broader tradition. It appeals to common, universal human sensibilities, ideas of justice, honor, fair play. And I think that's definitely there. Now, there are specific, I believe you're right, there are specific Christian themes in there in terms of the emphasis on certain types of redemption. Also, just like, his cosmogony, which is outlined more in the Silmarillion, is obviously...
that's much more explicitly
It's
Christian.
Ilúvatar is obviously kind of like God. The Maiar, Valar, you could say like angels or something. But also another thing I have to say is a lot of people out there, they know this. Tolkien is a Beowulf scholar. He was one of the preeminent experts on Beowulf. And Beowulf, that the story, I think it was written down in like the 8th century. I think that's the current estimate. There's arguments about this, okay? Somewhere in the 8th century to maybe early 10th century, but really I think the older dates are probably more correct. Obviously, it was written by a Christian because they talk about Cain and other things. There's Christian assumptions in the novel, or not in the novel, in the story. But the story has a lot of pagan Scandinavian influences, Germanic influences, and actually Hrothgar the king probably was a historical king that lived in the early 6th century in Denmark. So it's right before the Viking Age proper. I think they call it the Vendel Age in Sweden. So there's a lot of this that he wanted to pour into the stories. One thing that I will say though is some people have said one of the reasons there is no religion in the world that he created is because obviously this is a world before Christ, so it's by definition a pre-Christian world. There's pretty strong indications in some of his writings that he viewed this as the world of the past. Actually, like this is like Middle Earth, Gondor. This area is obviously it's around Europe. The Shire is whatever. So okay, like setting that aside. So these are pagans. These are righteous pagans, but he knows a lot about pagan Scandinavia, the pagan Germanic world, and some of those ethics and values are very, very different from what the audience in 20th century West would know, and the values that he would himself espouse. And so, I mean, if you guys watched Northmen, which is based on a real legend from Scandinavia, and they have morals, they have an ethos, but it's very different than the Christian ethos in terms of their sense of honor and duty and fate. And if you had put that in, because Lord of the Rings, this world is mythology for English-speaking peoples, but if it had been like Scandinavian mythology, it would also be like kind of hard to relate to, and in some ways kind of unpleasant. And the morality would not, I think, have made as much sense. So I think in terms of like that question, I agree with you broadly. Might disagree on little details here and there, but I think why did he say that it was Catholic fundamentally? I don't know, but I mean, he was a believer. He was very sincere, and I mean, to each their own. Like that is what he believed as the author, and yet we as readers, we can take something different from it. When I first read it, in fact, when I first read it, and even when I watched the film, I mean, to me, it didn't seem super religious. It just seemed American in a way. Like it was like I could relate to it as an American in a lot of ways. So I think it's hard to know when Christianity ends and Western culture begins, and vice versa. Now that's changing a little bit. As a lot of people know.
Yeah,
but I think that's part of it.
I totally agree. I think that seemed like the Lord of the Rings to me. Like the more I was like thinking about this question, seems like this like somewhat perfect like meeting place between like Western culture, like classical Western culture, and Christian Western culture, where he like clearly really he's looked up to or respected like the like Anglo-Saxons, like the like kind of pagan cultures, and wants to keep some of their virtues like honor and courage and like yada yada, like that you see in Rohan, and but like kind of give them this more Christian ending or valence, like you see with like Theoden or Eowyn's story arcs, which like with Theoden, he kind of like embodies this at first like this fear of death and despair against insurmountable odds, and tries to retreat his people into Helm's Deep, even though like Gandalf urges him to fight his enemies head on. And this kind of retreat, reluctance to face death and battle, is against like the virtues of his ancestors, but also like the virtues of the pagan cultures that Tolkien is basing like him off of. And he kind of like starts his getting back to these virtues when he rides out in Helm's Deep, but he's like still, I think a different author maybe would have like ended his story arc there, where he like, okay, decides to ride out in Helm's Deep, like face the Uruk-hai, and face his doom with courage, and then like like gets killed off. All right, he's had a glorious battle death, but that's like not where Tolkien ends it.
He would have died in Martin's books. He would.
Exactly.
That idiot would have died.
yeah. But for Tolkien, this is like the start of his kind of like moral victory in the books, where he's like now overcome his fear of death, but in like a sort of like suicidal way. And then he like really achieves this like moral victory, which is this half of it is way more Christian. When he answers Gondor's call for aid and goes out to fight on Pelennor Fields because it's the right thing to do. And that just like that participation in the battle kind of completes his arc. And then he has his like glorious battle death then, and has like these wonderful like final words where he says, "My body is broken. I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company, I shall not now be ashamed. I felled the black serpent."
Yeah.
And it's like, now this is like the perfect kind of, the first half is maybe the pagan completion of the arc, and the second half is the Christian completion of the arc.
Yeah. Although what he's saying, with his fathers, I mean, that's kind of understandable. Sounds like Valhalla to me.
Yeah, that's maybe a little more pagan.
Yeah. So I mean, because the Rohan people are clearly based on kind of like Scandinavians, Germanic people. One thing I will say is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about this, and in a way, it's almost like Tolkien wrote. He wrote Fellowship of the Ring, and these books, this world. It's what if you are a devout Christian, and you write about these pagan people. Right, so you kind of like recreate them in your image with your ethos, right? Well, as you were saying that, that's what I'm thinking, and people have said that. We do the same thing. So if you watch the TV show Vikings, which like some people have watched,
I've watched not the whole thing, but I've watched it.
Yeah, but I mean, there's like racial diversity in the Vikings, and there's women that like really small women that are defeating very large men in battle.
It makes sense. Totally.
There's bisexuality and poly, and it's all I don't know, accepted, but it's kind of accepted. Look, this is basically progressive Hollywood with their morals, whatever you agree or not. But the morals of like tolerance, like self-actualization, sexual liberation, and they're putting it among pagan Vikings, Scandinavians. All right, and they were not like that in a lot of ways. Believe it or not, there was not a black Viking. Also, like lesbian queens are not a thing among the Vikings. Et cetera, et cetera.
I'm just saying, going to be the memory of everybody, like any average person watching the show. This is what they're going to think Vikings are like now.
Well, okay, so this is an interesting point that you're bringing up. So, what I was thinking though is like these TV shows, right? So like Viking culture and religion, like it's espoused by like very different people that have very different takes. So you have the Asatruer. Not all of them are white nationalists, but a lot of them are. and the Odinists, who are explicit white nationalists. So it's actually a big deal in the far white right, to be
news to me.
Viking. Yeah. Oh, you didn't know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Okay. Well, it is. But yeah. So in actually, for people who want to look it up, Google the Order. They committed a bunch of hate crimes in the early 1980s, and they were an Odinic cult as well. Like, they worshipped Odin together. But in any case, so that's the you guys can find the citations after that. I've read a little bit about it. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, okay? So that's my excuse, because it's a thing there. Okay, so yeah, and they're very, very far right, obviously, right? But then you have other people that want to turn the Vikings into, well, before Christianity, women were equal to men, and people were sexually liberated and all this stuff. And they were also there's evidence of non-white people in Scandinavia. There are, but not that many, but you can I know the DNA. There's some evidence, but because people did travel in the ancient world, believe it or not, right? Oh, wow,
crazy
great,
idea.
So I find it interesting that we're talking about Tolkien as where we started in terms of how people perceive it and how they interpret it and what they take from it, even though you can't make it totally plastic, right? But with the Vikings, for example, and which does Viking culture, Scandinavian culture, pagan culture, Germanic culture, Anglo-Saxon, pagan culture, does influence Lord of the Rings and Fellowship of the Ring, even though it's highly Christianized and it's made more, it's much more palatable to 20th century liberal, and liberal in the broad sense, English country gentlemen, right? But today we have the Vikings and we have these TV shows, and they're depicted as very woke, aside from the slavery and the rape part. But
just besides that, they were very progressive. Don't worry about it.
But the issue is that you can't be totally elastic. Everyone knows that the Vikings were about raping and slaving, so they have to include that, but they still make them somehow more progressive. And so you have arguments, and usually the Vikings are used as kind of props in arguments, oh, well, before Christianity, women had freedom and they were equal and all this stuff. It's actually not true. It's different. There was differences, but we need to get into that. And then you have these people white nationalists, and they're basically just for the listener and the viewer out there. So the logic that happened was, so Christian identity is a movement that comes out of British Israelism, which has been the traditional white nationalist religion, and it basically argues that white Anglo-Saxons are actually the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. Modern Jews are descended from Satan or Lilith, but they're a different species, and non-whites are animals. Okay, so this is obviously post-Christian heresy. Okay, but the problem is it's still Christian, and so these far right radicals are it's still a Jewish religion, and so they're okay, what's the alternative? Well, some of them just decide okay, well, what did our ancestors believe, right? And so they reconstruct a sense of what their ancestors believed. But the reality is we don't actually know a lot about Germanic religion. We know about the Prose Edda, and we know what Snorri Sturluson wanted us to know, but he was a Christian from 13th century Iceland. And so he had his own particular agenda and his particular biases, and we don't know a lot about the rituals. So they're reconstructing things. And so, we started the podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about fantasy. And okay, that seems kind of an obscure, nerdy thing, even though it's become a much bigger cultural thing thanks to Game of Thrones and HBO. But the reality is, we reconstruct and we create kind of worlds of our own imagining all the time. We don't call it fantasy. We call it reconstruction or creative anachronism or fiction or whatever. But I mean, it's all human creativity and our cultures and what we bring to it, So that is, I think, a good segue. I want to talk about Rings of Power with you because I know you have opinions. I'm not a big fan. I know you're not a big fan.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I'm going to get unsubscribes from the two people who listen to me who are big fans, and I'm sure there are people.
Does this show have big fans? That's a genuine question.
I mean, there are people who, yeah, no, they're probably not.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I mean, I don't think anyone's really a fan. I don't think anyone who says good things about that show, I don't think people who say good things about that show really like fantasy. That's what I'm going to say. They might say good things about the show, but it's not because they like fantasy, because they don't really like fantasy. They just like seeing their politics on the screen. So, I mean, you go. Like, I mean, I've been talking. I want you to express your opinions, because I know you have opinions on this.
Okay, I will preface this by saying I haven't really watched it. I have clips. I've read about it. I tried really watching it, and it was not good. So that's I can't go too in depth about like the ins and outs of the plot and everything. But
there's no real plot. But
yeah, not that there is a plot. But I think like
narrator, there's no real plot.
I mean, I think the I guess where to start with this. Well, like, on a very surface level, it just looks really bad. Like, it looks, sure, the CGI like it is probably like good on some parts, but like it looks generic. Like, there's not an actual design for this world or the show. Whereas like you look at the Peter Jackson movies, and you can like take any screen cap from it and like not really know that much about, or like not be like super into Lord of the Rings, and recognize that as like, this is Lord of the Rings, this is Middle Earth, just because the costume design and like the set and everything like that is very distinct. And that's not really the case for Rings of Power, where like you probably could just take a screen cap of Rings of Power, take a screen cap of any like Netflix fantasy generic show, put them side by side, ask someone like if they're from the same show, that person would probably say yes. Like, there's nothing like particularly special about it. And then like as far as the characters and story goes, I mean, this kind of just goes back to like what I was like talking about earlier, where there's like just doesn't seem like there's an actual foundation to this world or the story, or like what is the whole point of Tolkien is like this higher ideal that you're striving towards and like fighting for the good. And it's not clear that there's like any like real moral in this, or themes or anything like that in this show, other than just like, now Galadriel is like a super cool elf who everything she does is right, and she can beat up the bad guy, and she's always going to win and be correct. Which is also, just a side note, a complete contrast to how Tolkien wrote Éowyn as like the female warrior type character, where her whole arc is about like her trying to go into battle as like a shield maiden was like an act of despair and like literally like a death wish. And like her arc, and she does like go into battle, she like sneaks out and kills the Witch King with Merry. But Tolkien does not like use her success there as like a justification or like vindication of her choice to like reject her proper role. Which it's not even like a gender politics thing either. It's like her, like kind of her whole arc is like, it ends with her choosing like life over death, and choosing to live and like rebuild, and like she ends up marrying Faramir, and it's like a very like hopeful ending where she chooses to be like a grower of things and like rebuilding the world, instead of like choosing this like glory, like martial glory, like death in battle type of ideal that she was going for, which is not anywhere in the Rings of Power or Galadriel. Like there's not even like a thought past this like one-dimensional strong female character. I think that's basically sums it up for me.
So I guess what you're talking about is I think like the Mary Sue aspect, where she can do no wrong, etc., etc. So relating to our earlier conversation though of what we were talking about, so what's motivating her in the series is the death of her brother. And so there's the vengeance aspect. And ironically, that's actually true to pagan Scandinavian culture, where vengeance is extremely important, and blood feuds were a big deal. They're not big into forgiveness, like Christians, obviously. And so, inadvertently, they did stumble upon something that was real, but then like it was kind of like a weird pastiche where also there's like, quote, progressive modern elements combined with pre-Christian elements, and everything was kind of like mixed together in I think you made a good point in terms of it looked like yes, they put a lot of money into it, and when you're looking at like the polygon count, they had a big polygon count, like on a video game or something. It was very, very high res. It was lush. It gave the right sensory input to you, but just because it works, the math of it works, doesn't mean that it actually captured the spirit of the world of Tolkien. Frankly, I don't know what it captured the spirit of in any unique, distinctive sense, because I think the generic aspect that you're pointing to was a real thing. And it just shows, I suspect, that so Bezos wanted something to, rival Game of Thrones. Like, and this was like, let it be so, like in Star Trek The Next Generation, like just execute on it, right? They had like a bunch of money and they brought in these people, and they have these people supposedly have talent and they have money, but what do they lack? They lack passion, and it shows. It shows because at the end of the day, if nobody involved really cares, no one's going to put their foot down, and
True.
I think that's what happened. I think this is like lowest common denominator narrative that you saw. I mean, do you know anybody who watched it?
I actually do. Like, not. I think it's like a friend of a friend type of thing. And I remember talking about it, and the reaction was like, yeah, like I was like, oh yeah, it was kind of enjoyable to watch, and they did some cool tricks, and like, oh yeah, like Galadriel's like super badass, but like it wasn't anything. We argued a little bit about it, but like it was not like anything I think that was sticking with him. I think it was just like, all right, we were kind of passively watching this over dinner, and it worked as far as that, and that's about it.
Yeah, it's not meant. It didn't leave an imprint. It wasn't memorable.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who remember watching the Peter Jackson films, and it really impacted them. Or
yeah,
like
I remember I was
Potter.
tiny, like 4 years old, and I remember the first time I saw it.
Yeah. And so that's not going to happen with this.
No,
it's too generic. I think your point is generic is true. So I wanna pivot back to the books, the Elessar books, and rare books and all of this stuff. You're not the only person that does this sort of thing. There have been a lot of books. I read somewhere that like 99% of Victorian fiction, like, we don't even have any copies of. Like, not only are they out of print, you can't find copies because the books just got destroyed or just decayed. But they know that those books existed because there are references to those books in other books, just in terms of commentaries or bibliographies and whatnot. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of books disappearing, there's a lot of ideas disappearing, a lot of sentences disappearing. Is that a bad thing? Like, shouldn't like the only stuff that gets reproduced be the good? I'm asking you questions here in terms of what's motivating you and if you think there's a problem.
I mean, I usually pick the books that I want to reprint based off like personal interest and I think like historical value, where I'm not like I'm not very egalitarian about it, where I think just any book that has ever been written and has gone out of print should be reprinted. Like I think there's obviously books that have more value than others. Like, and I think part of the motivating factor here was that the ones that I have on my list were very shocking that they went out of print. Like, there's one that's like it's called The Mind of Napoleon. It's like a selection of his written and spoken words, out of print, like very hard to find a copy. And this is just like a collection of like Napoleon's writings and speeches, and that is like one of the biggest figures in Western history, and the type of figure that is worth like learning from, if like not looking up to in many ways, and understanding like historically or philosophically, what have you. And so it's like was rather shocking that like something like that would go to print from such like a famous figure. It's kind of same thing. One that has kind of been on the docket is called The Open Mind, and it's like a collection of lectures that Oppenheimer gave in the maybe 10 years after the bomb dropped, which again, extremely significant figure, very significant event like that, like you talked about earlier, like it's the nuclear warfare and nuclear bombs like hung over the world throughout the 20th century, and still do in practical sense now. We just don't think about them as often.
Yeah.
And so it's just like things like this where there's clearly like a lot of richness that has been lost, and that shouldn't be lost. And I've also had like many conversations with my brother actually about this, because he was like the kind of person who has always been very entrepreneurial, but like hates being lectured at, and kind of thought like a lot of his life that he just wasn't into school, wasn't into learning, until he got a little older and then started reading like biographies of Napoleon or Alexander the Great and all this kind of stuff. And he would like come to me being like, why was this not the kind of thing that we're reading in school? Like, why am I not learning about any of this? Why did I not know any of this? Because now you're kind of picking for figures that are actually more aspirational, like, which I guess is quite like how Tolkien writes, is having like this higher ideal, like someone who's like actually aspirational, who's like can do like make great things happen. Where like in Tolkien, it's like the hobbits and Frodo are very humble creatures, but still have the potential for great deeds. Not so much with maybe a Caesar or a Alexander, but same idea. And I've just been like wanting to bring these kind of things more into the mainstream, because it seems like these are all low hanging fruit, but we've strayed so far from like real education that even there's this low hanging fruit has not been picked. And
yeah, I mean, I get it, because I think some people are going to be wondering, like, well, why do you have to do it? You have a lot of stuff going on in your life, and you're young. The issue is, like, if everyone has that attitude, it will never happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be somebody who has to do it. And so in the startup world, you often get asked, like, why you? Well, why not you? Why not me? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you give explanations. Oh, timing. We have like this set of like skills and talent. But someone's gonna succeed. Someone's gonna do what needs to be done, or it's not gonna get done. So I do think that that's an important thing to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of ancient works that we don't have, but that are alluded to. A lot of histories, a lot of plays. But some of these things that we have are only due to one copy. For the people out there who are listening and viewing, just remember that, especially like when it comes to the Greek stuff, you had three major choke points. You had the Byzantines in the 10th century, Constantine Porphyrogenitus. You had the Carolinian Empire, under Charlemagne in the 9th century, where he funded like a massive binge of copying. And then you had obviously Harun al-Rashid and I think Alamein, like in the early 9th century in Baghdad. But the three are actually quite different. So, for example, not quite different, but they're somewhat different. So, for example, we wouldn't have any of the Greek plays if it wasn't for the Byzantines, because that's their culture. They are Greek speaking, even if they identify as Romans, and they actually copied those. Muslims, for example, did not care about Greek plays. They did not care about Greek humanities. All they cared about was philosophy. So I think that's interesting to note that, we owe our understanding of the past, of the minds of the past, and the thoughts of the past to just a few instances. Now today, you can do copy, you can email, you can do this or that. I'm not gonna lie, I read a lot of ebooks, I read a lot of PDFs, but ebooks can be yanked, they can be re-edited. I do think the decentralization of books in physical material in medium is actually going to be a thing that we're going to value. I have friends who talk about buying physical books mostly because they're worried about the revisions, and some of you guys out there know that they're revising James Bond to make it more.
Oh, I didn't hear about the
correct.
James Bond one.
Yeah,
I've heard about many others, but not the James
so
Bond
Ian
one.
Fleming, they're redoing Ian Fleming. They're re-editing it, and it's pretty weird. A lot of it is pretty weird. And are you a better writer than Ian Fleming? Like, do you capture James Bond? I mean, I don't know, but I mean, they're changing it, and the people are not going to know. Another thing that actually just came out in the LA Review of Books, it's kind of related. Martin Heidegger's work, and you guys probably know Heidegger from being in Time, super influential, also kind of a Nazi. And that's obviously kind of a problem because he's super influential and he's a Nazi. being being them separately is okay, but in modern culture, being a Nazi and being influential is not okay. And so the way that they square the circle is after World War II, basically there's he died I think in the 60s or early 70s, but recently his son and his executors have been editing the writing selectively, even mistranslating things.
Really?
So yes. So they mistranslated acronyms to like remove National Socialism and stuff and weird stuff. Now I'm bringing this up partly, and I tweeted it out today. I'm bringing this up because I had took a philosophy class with like a professor who was like a Heidegger stan, and I kind of went through a rabbit hole for a little while, and I was like, he's a Nazi, so why is like he cool? I don't like me, like I'm not like pro-Nazi, but there are evil people that have good thoughts or interesting thoughts, so I wasn't necessarily opposed, but from everything I saw, Nazis are expelled from public life, and like some people out there are going to be like, oh well, he left the Nazi party, blah blah blah. I mean, come on, like he wasn't Spengler, who was like anti-Nazi. Like he was definitely sympathetic, so there's stuff like he talks about how his son is like, he wasn't anti-Semitic, he just had concerns about world Jewry. So, the literal quote,
yeah, they're just minor concerns. It's like not that deep.
So but I'm pointing this out because it's not actually the world that we know. We see it, we see through the mirror darkly, and we are being manipulated sometimes in some ways, and it's important that you do what you do. I think that this is a rationale. So when you asked about reading, Antonio Garcia Martinez, the tech guy, whatever, he's saying like we're entering the age of orality because Zoomers don't read. It's like the visual medium and like audio, and people are talking about ChatGPT means that like you don't have to like write things down in any structure. You just like make a query. So I told Antonio, I was like, it sounds like the age of retardation to me. I mean, I can say it. This is my podcast. I can use the R word. So don't try to cancel me. But but I'm old. But I suspect that we're on the same page. But like, I want to hear like a young person's voice on this because you have lived, like your whole life has been on the internet age.
Yeah. I think it's partly true. Like it's partly true because I think a lot of people, like people my age that I know, or like my age range or whatever, tend to go for we'll go for audiobooks, podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. But it just seems like a little short-lived, I guess. Like, I guess what I mean by that is if you're listening to an audiobook, you're kind of passively absorbing the information, and like not really. It's very different from reading. Like you kind of zone out. If you're reading, can't really space out, or you're gonna lose what's going on in the thread. You're gonna stop reading, and I think it works up to a point, where you can kind of just grab nuggets from things, and that's fine. I think we'll probably do some like audiobooks with like some of the Elessar books that are coming out. But I don't know. It's just it just seems like more of like a tendency towards being passively consuming, rather than like actively learning, and that seems like there's a very there's kind of like a general pushback against that. Like it seems like people are a lot more like recently concerned about education, which is like a whole other sphere of things. But like since COVID, people just have been like trying to find alternative ways for to like just educate young kids. And I think part of that honestly is like there's obviously a place for technology, and that's great, but part of that I think is like choosing to be an active reader, active learner, rather than just like passive listener. So I think it'll go as long as it can, kind of like when you're like in a class where you can just skate by. And then, but if you like end up in a hard class, or at some point the teacher gets strict, or you have to like actually do something, do something more concrete, then it's going to have to shift a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of reading, I want to make a reference to a book. I know for you Zoomers out there, it's like this is like, structured in chapter. No, just joking. No, but there's a book called Warriors of the Cloisters: A Central Asian Origins of Science in the Medieval World. And it's by Christopher Beckwith. He's a Tibetanologist. I'm only bringing this book up because he makes the argument that the recursive argument method, he makes the argument, but basically like the disputed questions that you started seeing in the medieval world, he makes the argument it comes from medieval Central Asian Buddhism that was absorbed into Islam, and then it was spread into Western Europe. Now, the point here from my perspective is this is really dependent on a written medium that's very structured, and you can see the coherent, like, when you read Summa, and then like some of these other works, they're like subdivided in ways that allow you to kind of engage point by point and respond point by point, and then it's kind of like an iterative process. Whereas, a lot of oral debates, even if I did debates about winning.
Yeah.
A lot of the writing, it ends up to be about learning, I think. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think like, this is why like books are important, because it kind of it pulls out the personality and like the personal aspect, because when you're engaging in an oral conversation with people, I think it's just natural you get invested in your arguments. Obviously, on Twitter people get invested in their arguments too, so whatever. I don't want to exaggerate, but I do think the written medium detaches us from our argument and puts it in this structured format. And also, I talk differently than I write. People routinely say that when they meet me, but I'm like, who writes
everybody?
the way they talk? Yeah, I mean, so it's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of structuring your arguments, and I think that we might be losing something there.
I think it's actually a very good point. Something I've had to kind of relearn, I guess, over the last year or so is, I think there's way too. I didn't realize that this was generally true until I realized it myself. That there's like way too much leeway for abstraction now, just in general, of like how people think, talk, learn, work, whatever. And there's that, and if you're just like too abstract with like, I don't know, your ideas, what you want, your goals in life, like how you like think through problems, whatever, you're not really getting anywhere. You're not achieving anything. You're like, it's very hard to like have to actually move forward towards anything, or know where you're moving towards. And I think you're right. Like writing is very good about like, you have to actually concretize things when you write it down on a page. Like I've even talked about this with my friends in like more of a silly way, where you maybe get in your head too much about like a problem, or like get emotional or something, and then you start like just writing it down and realize you're being like your logic makes no sense, like what your thoughts about the problem are like not making sense, but you can kind of justify yourself in your own head, and even sometimes when you're talking to someone else. But if you have to like look at your own words on the page like separate from you, and realize objectively this makes no sense, this is the wrong way to go about it, then I think that's very important and powerful, and there's too much, like there's not enough push towards that.
I would say the art of speaking, the art of dialogue verbally, orally, is by necessity to some extent the art of rhetoric. Even if you're not technically doing rhetoric, I think that this is how it works out. Obviously, you can do the same thing in writing. There's polemical writing, there's op-eds and stuff like that. But it's not all that. Like some of it is like, quote, dry, which basically means like the humanity has been leached out of it. And it's like, concepts that are kind of independent from you as a person. So I do worry about reading and the lack of reading. People have, in my generation, people like lied about what they read, but at least they actually bothered to lie.
Yeah,
like
people don't do that anymore.
No,
they're like waving around like trashy romances from the drugstore. That's about it.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of this is I don't want to end on a dark note as we're closing on our conversation, or like a sad note, but this is one of the reasons I asked you why Elessar, because we're rich, we're wealthy, we have supercomputers in our pockets, but there's something in the spirit of modern man, that, and you mentioned it, there's an ennui. There's like a lack of direction, a listlessness despite our affluence. There's something missing. I think the shift away from text, I think that's going to accelerate that, honestly, because when you read a translation, cause, I mean, I can't speak I can't read Greek. Read translation of Homer, that speaks to you. It's a different alien culture, but it speaks to you. If you're Christian or not a Christian, you read the Bible, that speaks to you. Can you imagine people just chattering each other over TikTok, and that's what their input is?
Yeah,
you don't need to imagine it. You don't need to imagine it.
You don't need to.
I know you're not like that, and I don't want to be like the crotchety old guy that's like, kids today, but
it's okay. It's kind of true. I can end this on a high note, so feel free to be as negative as you want.
All right. So you know what? Like, I have kids. I wanna think that there's hope. So close it out. Like, tell me, Nicola.
Okay, I think my high note to end on, which is what like part of the motivating factor for Elessar, both like the book publisher and the Substack, which is Substack's more for like short form works. It's just like when you actually look back at real history or like in real like writings that from the past, and how people actually thought, you realize that the negative side is that you realize you've kind of been lied to about like how people actually were in the past, what they thought, how backwards it was, which it was way less so than we think. And that's the negative side, but the positive side is that I think you kind of just realize like how I guess like the heights that humanity actually can go, and how we don't really need to remake the wheel, that there's like a huge wealth of knowledge, intellect, philosophy, spirit that is like just waiting to be drawn on. And it's there. We just kind of need to go for it. And yeah, that's been kind of a very inspirational point for me.
I mean, 2 words, it's there.
Yeah.
It's there. So, I think whatever happens going forward, maybe it's not predestined. We have a choice,
A little bit of both.
Yeah. All right. I think we've been talking for long enough. It was great talking to you, Nicola. Everyone should check out the websites. I'll put the links out there, and I will see you around.
Yeah, see you around. Thanks so much for having me.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite